Margaret,
Yes?
I'm not going to marry you.
Sure you are. Because if you don't marry me, your dreams of touching the lives of millions with the written word are dead. Bob is going to fire you the second I'm gone. Guaranteed. That means you're out on the street alone looking for a job. That means all the time that we spent together, all the lattes, all the canceled dates, all the midnight Tampax runs were all for nothing, and all your dreams of being an editor are gone. But don't worry, after the required allotment of time, we'll get a quickie divorce and be done with me. But until then, like it or not, your wagon is hitched to mine.
Welcome to the Graveyard Slot, where we talk about movies past their prime time.
Here, we revisit old favorites with a fresh perspective to see if they deserve more credit or if they should stay buried. I'm Sohini.
And I'm Sarah, and today we're talking about The Proposal. Before we get started, we want to encourage whoever might be listening to donate to Med Global's Sudan Emergency Appeal. Your contributions would provide life-saving services to help ensure that the most vulnerable receive the healthcare services they urgently need.
These donations will go towards emergency kits, medical personal protective equipment, and diesel fuel to support the running of hospital generators. Please go to medglobal.org/Sudan Emergency Appeal to make your donation.
Today, we're talking about The Proposal. About to be deported to Canada, ruthless editor-in-chief Margaret strong-arms her assistant, aspiring editor Andrew, into marrying her. With the immigration office hot on their heels, Margaret and Andrew spend the weekend selling the slide to Andrew's surprisingly large, complicated, and, worst of all, loving family. This movie was released in 2009, directed by Anne Fletcher, who did 27 Dresses, Step Up, and other movies and TV episodes. Which I have to say, first of all, directing Step Up, the original, iconic. Second of all, directing 27 Dresses, not a flex. We talked about doing 27 Dresses on the spot before, but we both tried watching it and could not get through it. It's not good. And this movie was written by Peter Chiarelli, who is one of the screenwriters for Crazy Rich Asians and was also a screenwriter for Now You See Me Too. I was surprised by this fun fact.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild card. 27 Dresses I could see, but Crazy Rich Asians. But yeah, this is one of those movies that both you and I watched when we were younger and have revisited a couple times over the years, but today we are looking at it with a bit more of a critical eye to see whether it holds up so many years later or whether it deserves the abysmal Rotten Tomatoes rating that it's got.
Yeah, gotta admit, the rating is too low, don't you think?
To me, just under average seems like kind of an appropriate place to be for this movie. And the reviews that I found kind of echo that sentiment. A couple of the ones that stood out to me all kind of pinpointed it as sort of mediocre and not really doing anything interesting with the genre. And the one that I specifically wanted to mention is from Empire magazine. And it says, despite good moments and likable leads, this lacks both heart and humor in a confection that smacks of the overfamiliar. And this is the one that I agreed with the most because I also really enjoyed the dynamic between the lead characters, and I think it had real potential. But where I think the movie falls short is filling in the gaps with the rest of the story. Yeah, witty banter is fun and all, but I feel like the movie kind of lacked emotional depth and nuance when it came to building on the characters' feelings for each other, especially because it takes place over a handful of days. I needed more of that to convince me of the characters building feelings for each other, and I feel like the movie just didn't do enough.
I agree. But having said that, why I think I enjoyed it so much and why maybe I like it a little more is also for the same reasons as why the critic disliked this movie. And this review from Los Angeles Times puts it really well. It reads, just a good old-fashioned romance, one in which people actually bring out the best in one another rather than the worst. How novel is that? That is what I did really enjoy about this. Overly familiar, like your review said, but in a good way, without the absence of any meaning or emotion at all. You know what I mean? It's still genuine. They were following story beats that we know, but they weren't just ticking off boxes for no reason. They were actually trying to execute those things and following through on why people like those moments or tropes or whatever. But we already mentioned or alluded to, like, it also didn't really bring anything new. Just to go back to this review specifically, just the sentiment of, like, how novel is that? And it's like, yeah, it is novel. It's all I want. I just want sentiment. Like, I just want a second where we can just not be, like, ironic about it.
And I mean, overly familiar doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. In fact, part of the allure of the genre of romance is that it is predictable and you know how it's gonna end. The novelty of it comes from the way you're approaching it and your take on familiar tropes and story beats. And I could see moments where the movie was playing with certain tropes and kind of, using them for a comedic effect, which was really fun. I just wish we had more of it. And I wish the movie had more to say when it came to the parts other than the comedy.
I agree. So, as usual, we will be talking about this movie chronologically, and we start with our two main leads' morning routines. So this is Margaret, the editor-in-chief, and Andrew, her assistant. And he is her assistant and not like an assistant editor. I think this is one of many things they get wrong about the industry. So, context, we are familiar with the industry, I guess. And I just wish they had actually shown an actual like publishing company and editor and like assistant instead of just like, using like the generic high-powered person and their assistant and then like slotting it into a publishing company, especially because it seems to make up a lot of, especially Andrew's characterization, like all of his issues with his family and stuff is about their respect for publishing and stuff, and that's totally like an interesting topic.
I totally agree, and I have a similar complaint, which is that they kind of treat a publishing house like any other office. The petty part of me while I was watching is like, there aren't even books in the office. I'm like, where are all the books? It's a publishing house. It also just feels too corporate, and it just feels like they made the characters work in publishing as sort of like an afterthought. I feel like it could honestly be any other profession and it wouldn't make that much of a difference to the story, which is why this is not such a strong aspect, because it's not integrated into the story at all. And as someone who is a little bit more familiar with publishing than the average person, I guess, it does kind of take me out of the story.
The book thing, the fact that there are no books around, bugs me a lot. It's not like a fantasy or an exaggeration to say that a publishing office is covered in books everywhere.
Yeah, they're overflowing. Often we see Margaret with this giant manuscript in hand, but I don't think there's even any books in her office. There's no shelf or anything.
Anyway, our rant aside.
Yes, publishing rant over.
Actually, let me bring back the publishing bit, because when Andrew arrives at the office, gives Margaret her coffee and everything, he gives her this manuscript and, says, this is really good, he says buy it, which is not really how you would say that, but whatever. Saying they should publish it, and Margaret shuts him down, but he says this is the kind of novel you used to publish. And I was like, oh, interesting thread. I don't remember this being in the movie, and it's not.
Yeah,
we don't get a thread about Margaret having changed as an editor, that her front list has evolved through time to be more money centric or profit forward or whatever, instead of the kind of books that should be published, or that her integrity has crumbled or anything. So why is that there?
It feels like a fragment of a subplot they meant to have in the story and then decided to take it out, but they didn't take out that one line.
It also suggests that he is personally familiar with her backlist, as an editor, and he does mention later on in the movie, that is the best editor in town and blah 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 blah, and we just never really see that.
Yeah, it's all very surface level, and again, I think it's an extension of them not really integrating their identities as editors and people who work in publishing and people who are even passionate about publishing into the story. It's all very coincidental. It doesn't feel intentional.
Yeah, which sucks because it's such a big part of their identities, I feel like.
Yeah, that's how their relationship begins, with them getting to know each other in this context. And it would make sense for their developing relationship and the way they see each other as that starts to change, for that to reflect onto the way that they see each other's work identities as well.
Well, yeah, especially because, like, if we're to believe that, Margaret was, like, this really respected editor who's, like, kind of changed over time because of, like, money and stuff, then he knows her even more. You know what I mean? Like, he maybe, like, from afar has read, like, all of the books that she's edited, has this idea of her, and then he works for her, and she's, like, this monster, which we haven't said. She's, like, very, like, strict and, like, kind of rude and blah, blah, blah.
And, I mean, the building blocks are there. During part of her introduction, she's on the phone with this author, and she's pressuring him to go on this TV show to promote his book, even though he doesn't want to. And I feel like that could have been part of her arc as an editor and, becoming more commercial and pressuring her authors to do things they don't want to do just because that, boosts the chance of them making more money. But yeah, they don't really go anywhere with it.
No. I will just say, like, I was a little confused why everyone on the floor is, like, scared of her and or are working for her. Like, at first I thought she was just, like, one of the editors, and I'm like, then they wouldn't all be working for her, you know what I mean? Like, there are other editors. Then I guess she's, like, the editor-in-chief, but also, like, there's only her and, like, one other guy. It's just, like... They had, like, 25 assistants and 2 editors, and that's it.
That's just how demanding she is. She needs 25 different flavors of coffee delivered to her throughout the day. Yeah, I don't think they did enough research about publishing houses.
If at all.
And you can feel it in the vibes. It doesn't feel like a publishing house at all.
For sure. Speaking of coffee, I do really like, right off the bat, the back and forth between them, the dynamic, because they're, like, having actual conversation throughout the quote-unquote bantering. They're not just, like, insulting each other for no reason, which is always usually what I dislike from, like, poorly written versions of this dynamic. But one of the, I guess, defining moments, I would say, is the whole thing with her coffee, because he gets 2 cups of coffee, one for Margaret and one for him, Andrew. And they're both her order, so that if he spills hers, he can give her his. Which, like, I think, honestly, is such a good shorthand for their relationship.
It is.
He's molded, like, every aspect of his life for this job for her. And also, like, the way they talk about it says a lot about their relationship as well. Like, they're so open about it. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like he's scared of her, of, like, oh, is this embarrassing that I do this? It's like, we both know, like, what this dynamic is, and they're very playful about it, even though, it doesn't lessen any of the, like, stakes.
I agree. There's also this part where he's talking on the phone with his family because he's supposed to be visiting them over the weekend. And when Margaret stops by his desk, he pretends like he's talking to someone else for business. But when he hangs up, he's like, "Was that your family?" And he's like, "Yeah." Yeah. So I also really enjoyed their dynamic. But with the coffee thing, I feel like it is a great shorthand, but they kind of turn it into a longhand by talking about it a little bit too much. A part of me was like, that was great subtext without having to, expand on it. And I think it could have been more powerful if Andrew didn't say anything about it, because he was like, oh, it's not like I do that at all. And if Margaret just caught on it anyway and then just commented on how pathetic it was, and he's just like, yeah, I know.
That, you know what? No, that's good. Because what I liked about it is that he doesn't even deny it. But you're right, he could have denied it in a less lengthy way. But I guess to double down on her monstrous ways, the first thing we see is them going to this meeting with Bob, another editor, and her firing him.
I love how the way you phrased that kind of implies that she does this regularly. Like, every day she'll come in and fire a different person.
Hey, we don't know. We only see them at work for, like, one day.
True. Maybe that is what she does.
But she fires him because she wants one of their authors, Frank, to go on this TV show. And Bob, like, didn't make it happen. But she kind of persuaded Frank into it. And this comes back later. She ends up having to basically bail Frank out of the interview because, like, he doesn't want to do it at the end, after all. And, like, we don't know what she learns from that,
Yeah. I think that just goes to show the lack of development.
Basically, it all tracks, like, the whole thing about, like, the novels he used to publish, her pushing her authors to these more, like, commercial routes, her firing editors who do things in a different way, blah, blah, blah. But then it doesn't culminate into anything about her as an editor, which, like, I mean, I've already said this, but, like, it's kind of a big part of the story because of how much Andrew wants to be an editor.
Yeah, and actually, the way you phrase that makes me think it would have been much more interesting if it had been the case that Bob had a very different approach to Margaret, because as it is, I think they frame him more like this lazy guy who didn't even try because he knew or he assumed that Frank would never do it. But it would have been interesting if he gave the author the chance to decide for himself and respected the author's decision, and Margaret fires Bob anyway for just not being tough enough. But then by the end of it, she realizes that, you know, she's become blinded by the prospect of whatever it is. And she's been pushing her narrow perspective on everybody or something like that.
I do wish we had actually known what Bob was like. But what we do know about Bob is that he gets really upset about being fired and then storms out of his office and, like, yells at her and insulting, like, her personal life and her as, like, a person. And, like, she is rude, but this, like, frames him as, like, the bad guy, right? Like, he calls her a bitch.
He's like this caricature, basically, and his whole purpose in the story is to basically make Margaret look better and to humanize her ultimately when she admits that she was upset by what he said. But other than that, he doesn't really serve the plot in any way. He's just a tool, and not in the insulting way, or kind of, because he is, but...
Even if he is a tool, I wish he had just been, like, a more interesting tool for Margaret.
Yeah.
But because Bob is fired, Andrew has to kind of go through Bob's manuscripts over the weekend, which puts a damper on Andrew's plans because he has his grandmother's 90th birthday party that weekend. But soon that won't matter.
Yeah, because Margaret gets pulled into her boss's office and she finds out that she's about to be deported to Canada. And that is when she comes up with this last minute idea. Andrew comes in at the wrong time and she clocks him and she's like, I'm engaged to Andrew. We are engaged.
I loved the scene. I think it was so funny how, like, unbelievable they were. They were so bad at faking it. And you can see, I don't know if it's the actor or, like, genuinely the character, but the bosses don't believe them.
Yeah.
And the main boss, the guy who's, like, sitting at the desk, is, like, laughing through it. It really, for me, set the tone for the rest of the movie whenever anything happened. It was just silly. It was never, like, genuine stakes, you know? You were never like, oh, they're actually deceiving this person or that person. It was all, like, so obvious and silly, and I loved it.
Yeah, you're right. I think it does work in the movie's favor that they don't try to convince us that the other characters are convinced because it is so absurd. And I kind of buy it that her bosses want to keep her there so desperately. They're like, you know what? Whatever. Just take care of it however you can. And as long as you're still here, it doesn't matter. And also, the amount of shock Andrew is in throughout is really funny too.
I know.
I really like how his emotions, you can kind of see them develop and boil over throughout. Like, from the publishing house up until they go to the immigration office, you can see him slowly processing it and getting over his shock. And he plays it really well.
He does. I will say, I liked that, like, she is presumably older, and there are, like, a little things dropped here and there to, like, insinuate that that is the case. For one, obviously she's his boss and, like, has been an editor for a long time, I assume. And there's the whole thing where, like, when she arrives and the grandma calls her a girl and then she sees her and she's like, oh, that's not a girl. And just, like, so many things to do with, like, their dynamic or just, like, their relationship and how people see it. And I do like that part of what's unsaid kind of is that, like, really you're choosing this older woman. I like that we get to see that in this rom-com, I guess, that he is, like, falling in love with this woman who people think is unattractive because of her success.
That's a great point. And there is this point where they're bonding later on and he just tells her point blank that she's a very beautiful woman. And in that context, That's very sweet, what you said.
Yeah. But so I really like the way she convinces him.
Yeah, it does make sense.
It totally makes sense. Like, it's so logical because they want to make Bob, the guy she just fired, to be the next editor-in-chief when she leaves. And she's like, well, if they make Bob editor-in-chief, he will immediately fire you. Talking to Andrew. And it's true. Again, the way they speak to each other and how frank they are almost like grounds this movie. So I really like the way she convinces him. And it's also not just like a straight up blackmail. She's not just like, you're my assistant and you have to do this. So and it makes it like not icky. I think this is what I was trying to say with the banter thing, and I will get more into this later, but like there's like this understood friendship between them that really makes it comfortable for the audience to buy into the things that they choose to do together.
I don't know that I sense a friendship between them yet, but I do sense that there is this sort of camaraderie, maybe. They don't have malicious intent toward each other.
A relationship, like whatever the relationship might be.
They're on the same team, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It is a little bit iffy, just slightly to me, that she is holding over his dream of being an editor over him, because she's like, if you do this and you do the immigration interview, then yeah, fine, I'll make you editor. And it's like, it's not the most ethical way of going about things. But when she is laying out the facts of why he has to do this, it really doesn't feel icky because it's true. His job is on the line, and not because of her, but because of the circumstances.
But yes, they do get to the immigration office. And Margaret is both entitled and racist.
Yep, that is what I have in my notes. The amount of entitlement and racism is astonishing. Don't know which is worse, frankly.
I know which one is worse. But they actually get interrogated for possibly committing fraud, and they're told that they will be investigated and blah, blah, blah. But like you mentioned, Andrew actually finagles a promotion to editor out of her throughout this interview. So good for him.
Yeah. At this point, you can really sense a shift in their power dynamic, because now Andrew has processed what happened and he's well aware that Margaret needs him. So when they leave the immigration office, he asks her to propose.
This is honestly really funny.
It was really funny. Firstly, especially because so far he hasn't really had a choice in anything, the shift in their power dynamic is really satisfying. And I like the double meaning in Andrew asking Margaret to get down on one knee and propose, because this traditional gesture takes on a different meaning given their context and shows Margaret having to cede her power before Andrew. And especially the use of physical comedy here was really funny, because she gets down on her knees with his help, but then once he's done talking to her, he just leaves. And then she's just like kneeling there trying to get up by herself in her tight dress and her high heels.
Her very high heels. The entire movie, I kept watching her heels like, ma'am.
Not weather appropriate, but very impressive.
So impressive. One time she walks on gravel, I was sweating. Genuinely. But because they were trying to convince the immigration officer that they're actually a real couple, Margaret says that they're going to his grandmother's 90th birthday that weekend, and it's in Alaska. Also, again, same with the bosses. I love how the immigration officer does not believe them at all. And it just adds to, like, again, the silliness of everything.
I think there's not one character in the entire movie that buys it.
I think the mom, and that's it.
Yeah.
But yeah, they go to Alaska.
Yep. They take an extensive route there, I have to say, which starts off with 2 different flights. And during the first one, they are going through this list of questions that they have to know the answers to in time for their interrogation with immigration. And there's this part where Margaret's talking about the difference in their lifestyles and how she has this fancy apartment and he probably lives in this pokey little place filled with yellowed paperbacks. And the dismissiveness in her tone when she was talking about the books kind of made me feel like she's not really passionate about publishing at all. And combined with how easily she agreed to make Andrew an editor, it kind of felt like the movie was trying to say something about her attitude towards publishing. But again, it feels like an incomplete thread.
Yeah. We also find out that obviously Andrew knows all of these things about her because he has to as her assistant, and she like basically knows nothing about him, which is a thread that I wish we had followed through on. Like, it was just a detail that was given to us, and I wish that had actually fed into the way their relationship works and how it develops romantically, or just like as it deepens, because it never actually adds to their actual relationship. It never gets followed through on.
I thought that was where it was going as well, that she would find out all of the same things about him. But not only does that not happen, but her attitude also doesn't change, knowing that he knows all of these things about her, specifically because of his job serving her. She never has this moment of enlightenment about the way she's been treating him, or how his life's purpose basically seems to revolve around hers. And even when they have this moment where they're talking and she tells him more stuff about herself, and we kind of see this information that Andrew seemingly knows about her. We see it in a new light because she gives him context that he didn't have before. Even then, it feels half finished because it feels like she's not reciprocating for Andrew. It never feels like she takes the time to really get to know him outside of, the sham.
Yeah.
I think that is what kind of sets up the romantic plotline for failure, because they never get to know each other on a deeper level as friends. Like, it's already the dynamic they have, which is great, but it's never really built upon where they get to an equal level, where they know each other equally, and the relationship then develops into something romantic. I think that's why it feels so incomplete.
We never see it become anything special. But they get welcomed by his mom and grandmother, but things just keep spiraling, I guess, because they have to actually take a boat from the plane to get to his house, which is gigantic. And this is when she realizes that he's super rich.
I swear, it feels like they travel for 100 years. They just keep going, because there's a plane, and then there's another plane, and then there's a car, and then there's a boat, and I'm like, just get there already. And the entire time, Margaret is so prickly and her rude self, and especially to the grandma, I was appalled, because forget the fact that she's putting Andrew's career and future at risk. She doesn't even care that she's barging into his family and making them a part of this fraudulent scheme. And then she's sarcastic with the grandma too. Like, I can excuse racism, but sarcasm towards grannies is where I draw the line. But on their way to the boat now, they have to go down this ladder. And as you mentioned, she's wearing very high heels. But I do like the physical use of levels here, because by scaling the ladder down, Margaret is physically having to deign to following Andrew's wishes. And it also highlights on a physical level how not fit she is as a part of his family and as a part of their environment. And it was just very painstaking, and I like that the scene went on just a little bit too long. Like, they drew it out just long enough for it to be funny.
Yeah. So they get to the house.
It's time to party.
Yeah, lots of people are there. There's a welcome home party that's a bit of a surprise, and he's really upset about it. And you know what? I would be too.
Yeah.
I just went through like a 4-vehicle journey across, I have to assume, 3 oceans.
5 if you count walking. They do walk a lot too. And in those heels?
Yeah, exactly.
The heels are another mode of transportation.
Yeah. But yeah, there's this welcome home party and everyone's there.
Andrew's dad immediately antagonizes him upon seeing him, because he makes light of his job and then also implies that he's using Margaret to get ahead. And that's when Andrew tells his dad that he's engaged. And the whole thing comes out to everybody, and they start asking how Andrew proposed. This is another one of those scenes that I think works really well because of how they draw it out. Because initially Andrew makes Margaret tell the story, but when he realizes that she's making him look really bad, he starts interrupting, and they start talking over each other and taking the story in like wildly different turns. And it ends up being this really weird proposal story.
Yeah.
And I really like how they subvert the usual romantic trope as well, because on the surface they're talking about these sweet romantic gestures, but because we know their dynamic and we know what they're like, we can tell they're trying to embarrass each other, and it was really funny.
Yeah. I will say, I don't like the amount of non-consensual touching in this movie and how it's played off as comedy. I keep trying to be like, okay, it's just supposed to be funny, but I'm like, it made me really uncomfortable every time he touched her and she's like, don't touch me there, and he just kept doing it. And it happens like multiple times. And also the way that one of the other characters, who is the guy who's like an exotic dancer, and he kept like hitting on her, and like he makes her really uncomfortable, and she has to like edge around a shelf to get away from him and everything. And it's like never taken seriously. Like, even, okay, obviously the stuff that Andrew does when he touches her when she doesn't want him to is bad enough, but even if I buy into that as like a quote-unquote joke, like this part with Ramon, I think is his name, like there's not really any like rose-tinted glasses for that.
From the beginning, this character doesn't respect Margaret's boundaries, and it's just uncomfortable every time he's on screen. And his whole character doesn't even serve a purpose in the plot. And honestly, if there were one part or one character that I could remove from this movie, it would be him.
What they could have done and did is like just make him like weirdly the every job character, because he's the stripper and the waiter and the convenience store guy and blah blah blah, and that's already funny enough.
And the efficient too.
Oh yeah, the efficient, yeah. We didn't need this whole like harassment thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The party does eventually wind down. They get to see their room, and it's one that they're sharing. And I will say, I was confused about why he doesn't have a room. Does he not just have a room? He grew up there. It's the house he grew up in.
Maybe they turned it into a gym when he left.
There's like 50 rooms in this house, and they had to turn his bedroom into a gym.
Goes to show how they feel about him, really.
But it really bugged me. I'm like, I thought the thing was gonna be like, oh, this is Andrew's room, and then Margaret's like, okay, where's mine? And it's like, oh, you'll stay here with Andrew. Duh.
Yeah.
Like, why are they in a guest? I was so confused.
That's a great point. That didn't even occur to me for some reason, but you're right. And it would have been such a great opportunity for Margaret to get to know more about Andrew.
That is such a big part of this premise.
Yeah, when they go back to the childhood house, yeah.
But, so they're introduced to their guest room and also the dog, Kevin, who Margaret is deathly afraid of. Yeah, but since they're not actually together, Andrew sleeps on the floor.
There's also this whole drawn-out sequence where Margaret gets changed into her pajamas, and she makes sure Andrew's not looking multiple times before she goes over to the bed. And her hesitance to be seen in the state does make sense, because it's not just about maintaining a professional front or being shy, because, you know, it's the lack of the armor she's usually got and showing the real person underneath. And I like how the colors of her outfits reflect that too, because the dress she was wearing before was gray, and we've also seen her wearing like these dark colored clothes throughout. But her pajamas are light pink and have this delicate lace detailing. And it's the first time she's shedding that armor in front of him.
Yeah. In the morning, Frank actually calls her, freaking out about the interview that he doesn't want to do. But because she has to take the call outside, Kevin actually gets out and gets taken by an eagle. And she has to save Kevin, but in exchange, the eagle takes her phone.
I do like that even though Andrew's family doesn't totally buy that their relationship is genuine, they kind of go along with it. It implies this kind of implicit trust between them and Andrew, and they trust what he's doing. I did think this scene went on a little bit too long. It felt like one of those scenes that they could have cut slightly shorter, because the funny part wasn't the fact that the eagle takes the dog. I think the funnier part was that she's trying to offer the dog in exchange for the phone. So I wish that is what the emphasis had been on, and the misunderstanding behind the scenes when they think that she's just playing with the dog.
I totally agree. But so for the rest of the day, she's gonna go out with the girls, and he is gonna talk to his dad, and he has this one-on-one with the dad, who is supposed to apologize to him after being, talked into it by the mom, but is instead insulting him some more. The whole thing with the dad is like he wants Andrew to come home and take over the family business. Andrew doesn't want it because he wants to work in publishing. I think this is a really interesting thread and plays quite well into Andrew's character as someone who wants to be an editor, if only they had fleshed that out more. But it's really interesting how in the first scene where we meet the dad, it seems more like he's insulting Andrew because of his position, because he's just an assistant, quote unquote. And the impression that I got in the beginning is more that, oh, Andrew's left and hasn't been home for 3 years and has kind of not shunned the family, but never really comes home, never really talks to them about it or anything, only to still be an assistant. And the dad, like, still a bad thing, but like the dad is like, you've got nothing to show for it. Like, you're working for this horrible person and you say it's because of your dream, but you're not even like achieving your dreams. But then in this scene with the one-on-one, it's that the dad just doesn't respect his work at all. And part of it is, like Andrew says, I get it. You don't get me sitting in like a cubicle reading a bunch of books. You don't get it. You don't think that's like respectable, which is part of the dad's issue with the career that he's chosen. And I think that's also really interesting paired with all of the like masculinity things happening throughout the movie. And that whole thing could have been a really interesting like thing to explore and to add as like depth to his character and his relationship with his dad and also the town as a whole. Because like when they were talking about his masculinity, it was like he was trying to make himself seem more quote unquote manly in front of like the entire town who's there at the party, and how that stems from his dad obviously, but also the whole town itself. And in this imagined subplot, part of the reason why he wants to leave it, in addition to obviously wanting to work in publishing. But yeah, it was just like, I don't know if it's bad, but maybe it is that they kind of changed the dad's issue with his job from one scene to another. Like, it could be both, to be fair, but in the first scene, it really sounded like, oh yeah, an editor's great, my son's just not one. Like, she's the editor, you know what I'm saying?
I agree. I think there was a lot of potential here, but the movie keeps setting up more than it's able to tackle. And when it comes to this subplot with the dad, I feel like it verges on cliche because they don't really handle it with any originality. Like, yeah, I like the setup, and I feel like the issues that he mentioned in the first scene compared to the second scene, they could kind of be different parts of the same problem. Like, the dad is like, it's bad enough that you're sitting in an office doing this job that I don't respect. But even within that, you're still an assistant. Like, you couldn't even achieve editor. Not that I would have any respect for you if I did. I like the setup, but they don't do enough to develop it. The arc doesn't even have a real end because the dad never even has any kind of revelation about the importance of what Andrew does. And I thought that Margaret would help that come about, because isn't that part of the trope? Like, you go to your partner's or your love interest's childhood home and you confront toxic family members, or like you make them realize how talented your son actually is or whatever. But yeah, underdeveloped, I guess, is the best way to describe it. So while Andrew's having this conversation with his dad, Margaret is at this bachelorette party of sorts with Andrew's family and with his ex, Gertrude.
I was so confused about why she was there.
I think she's just like a family friend. But I like that Margaret happens to be wearing a white shirt to this, because it's like the bridal white, except in a professional context. And it's like those two worlds are clashing and showing how, Margaret is not really a fit in this world, but that she's putting on a front of like Andrew's fiance and everything. So I just like that detail.
But yeah, Gert is for some reason here. I don't hate her or anything. I was just confused about why she's there. But she does talk to Margaret at one point when she's taking a breather. And Margaret finds out that Andrew actually proposed to Gert and wanted to elope, but she turned him down because he wanted to go to New York and she wanted to stay. Which, ouch. honestly. Like, in her shoes, I would also be like, oh no. Because, like, her whole thing is that she's not actually ruining Andrew's life. You know, she's not messing up anything for him. It's not like he has a partner who has to go through this whole ordeal when they get married. She's not taking anything away. It's, like, supposed to be unobtrusive. But then she finds out, obviously, that Andrew has a life and a past and a potential ex, soon to be non-ex, I don't know. But this is one of the many times when she starts to realize that, maybe what she's doing is not very nice.
Yeah, and along with that realization, I do wish that she had some kind of remorse for the way she's treated Andrew, because she finds out that Andrew not only left his family behind, but also left this relationship because he wanted to work in publishing in New York. And it feels like a key moment for her to realize how she stunted his dreams by keeping him as her assistant for so long. But they never really deal with this aspect of their relationship.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't even make that connection.
About that scene with Gert and Margaret, the only other thing...
Oh my god, they have the same name, Gert and Margaret.
Huh.
That would freak me out. That would end a relationship for me.
Yeah, that's a little crazy. But at the end of this conversation, they toast to Margaret and Andrew, and Margaret's glass is actually empty. And I kind of like that detail because from her point of view, there's nothing to actually celebrate. So I liked that she ends up toasting with an empty glass.
Yeah.
And I like that they don't resort to the cliche of the ex and the current love interest clashing or anything. That would have been so boring.
Yeah. I was dreading it the entire movie.
Especially when, towards the end, when Gert comes in after Andrew realizes that Margaret's left, I was like, oh no,
Yeah.
I don't want her to swoop in or anything. And I'm so glad she didn't.
I will say, even the whole, like, the ex tells him to go get her was, like,
Yeah.
cliched enough that I was like, oh. I don't want her to not be in the movie at all because I do like what function it serves. But like every time she makes like a significant appearance, my whole body clenches up. But they do finally get home to, I have to say, the funniest scene in the whole movie and not intentionally. Andrew's like mad about his fight with his father. So he's, in my notes, chopping a log ? But he's actually like hitting a canoe with like an axe over and over again. And it is so funny because what are you doing, Andrew? He is an 8-year-old throwing a tantrum and it is genuinely hilarious. I was laughing so hard.
I love how they don't give him a childhood bedroom, but they do give him a canoe to hack away at when he's angry. And I assume that's been there for years and he's been using it over the years.
That's literally what they insinuate because the mom goes to yell at the dad and it's like, what did you do? He's at it again. He's hitting that damn canoe. I'm like, what?
Honestly, that is a refreshing take, right? You go to your partner's childhood home and you see their childhood anger management canoe.
But yeah, Margaret does overhear the parents fighting about Andrew hitting the damn canoe. So she knows what's up. And she asks him about it that night when they go to bed. And he doesn't want to talk about it. And so what ends up happening is she offers up some details about her own life. And I like this because the way it functions in the scene is less her randomly telling him stuff about herself and more in response to him clamming up. Like she's offering something to put him at ease. And it's really sweet.
It is. Especially in the context of their fake marriage where they have to know certain things about each other. The fact that she's offering up extra information, things that he doesn't really need to know and would have no way of knowing. The fact that she's opening up about that feels very personal and sweet. And I really like that the things she tells him are mostly things from her past that are separate from the office and that it gets more personal as she goes. She even tells him how long it's been since she last slept with someone before admitting to crying in the bathroom after the confrontation with Bob. And so it feels like the crying is one of the most vulnerable pieces of information she could reveal. And I also like that it was something from their shared professional environment, but from a different perspective, like where her persona and the way she's perceived are very different from what's actually real. Because she's seen as the stone cold woman who doesn't give a shit about anyone or anything, but it did hurt her. And the fact that she's willing to own up to that feels like a huge leap in their relationship.
I also like how obviously some of these things are vulnerable, but some of them are more like, oh, I really like this song or whatever. But the fact that it's in the context of him not wanting to tell her something really personal, like we understand that what she is telling him, even the stuff about like liking whatever music, is personal to her, especially because she doesn't usually open up to people. Like this is a show of trust and like vulnerability.
Yeah, she's finally ready for him to see her as a regular person. And I really like how the scene is blocked as well, because they're both lying down. She's on the bed and he's on the floor by the foot of the bed, so they can't see each other. But I just like how personal it is anyway. Like, the lighting is really beautiful, and they're both staring up at the ceiling, but it feels really personal somehow.
Intimate.
Yeah, intimate. And Margaret even asks at one point, "Are you there?" Like they're on a phone call. The whole thing is very sweet.
I really like the way it's performed and like the sound design, because the way they're talking is very like soft. It sounds like a conversation you would have before bed, you know, like as you're falling asleep.
Yeah.
I do really like how the more and more we'll learn about Andrew, it is kind of like he is more closed off than her in a sense. He doesn't talk about, well, his family at all, but also like his relationship with his dad and blah, blah, blah. But like she's actually quite vulnerable about a lot of the things that she herself deems personal. And Andrew is a little more closed off emotionally. And I really like that contrast, because he's supposed to be the like grounded everyman kind of guy, and she's the stone cold boss lady, but she's actually the one who's more vulnerable as opposed to him.
That's a great point. And a part of it must also be because of the nature of their jobs, right? Because there are certain things that he has to know about her as her assistant, and that necessity isn't reciprocal. Like, she doesn't need to know the same things about him. So it's actually easier for him to hide certain things from her than it is the other way around.
But yeah, I do really love how well done the peeling back of her character is, because everything she says here actually tracks with everything we've learned about her so far. We were actually fed like morsels of these facts earlier in the movie, not in like a subtle way or anything, just in a way that is pretty realistic, like things that would come up, and then here we see like kind of a more complete picture of it.
Yeah, you're right.
And when he teases her about the song she liked, and she laughs about him just messing with her to make her sing, that's what makes their dynamic work. It like shows that they do know each other and they know what makes the other person tick, which is what makes for the foundation of their relationship, which at this point is like a friendship. I think this is the moment when they're actually friends.
Yeah.
And like when he tells her that she's a beautiful woman, it doesn't even come off as romantic, but something nice.
Yeah.
He's telling her as a friend.
This definitely feels like a turning point in their relationship, just friendship-wise, like you said.
Yeah.
This feels like one of the strongest scenes in this movie, which is ironic considering the fact that it's following up what I would say is one of the worst scenes. We skipped over it, but right before this, there's this whole scene of them kind of running into each other without realizing the other one's there, and they're both naked because she just showered and he was about to. And the whole thing just felt very contrived and unnecessary.
I agree. I don't know what it did. It doesn't add anything to their relationship. It's not even like that awkward or anything or funny, or you know what I'm saying? Like it literally did nothing. It didn't have a punchline.
See, this is time they could have spent actually developing the subplots they set up, but
anyway, even though, like you said, I really liked the scene that night, but in the morning, she starts acting kind of weird around him. I honestly didn't know where this came from. Like, I genuinely was confused. They both noticed it. This is weird. Something's weird. But you know what else is weirder? The parents barging in and asking them to get married that very weekend.
that is weird, yeah.
I cannot express how stressed this made me. I'm like, you cannot ask that of a bride. I know you don't know that she's a real bride, but you cannot do that to her. Maybe they know that, like, she doesn't have any family or whatever, but, like, you don't know her life. Like, she has friends and shit that wants to be at her wedding. Like, I thought it was going to be a thing where she's like, oh no, like, I don't have any family left and I don't need my friends there. And then the family is going to be like, oh no, and then, like, embrace her even more into their family. And that was going to be a whole thing, right? That makes her emotional, but that's not part of it at all. And, like, no one is asking her if she wants to invite anyone to her wedding, really?
They've met her.
Fair. But yeah, I was just like, who does that?
I was thinking of it from Margaret and Andrew's perspective in that they have to get married anyway, so it doesn't really matter when they do it. But when I think of it from the parents' perspective, and they don't know that it's a sham marriage and everything, asking them to get married tomorrow is a wild request.
Exactly. But obviously they don't care, so they go along with it. And then we actually get to the scene that I hate the most, which is when she goes on a bike ride to clear her head and runs into the grandma. And there's the scene that is weird and offensive. I think this is too late for this to have been in a movie. Not that it was ever okay before then, but like, I genuinely was baffled. I'm like, why is this still here?
It was just painful to sit through, to be honest.
Yeah. I wish, like, they had just done something else where, like, oh, the grandma wants to teach her to dance because she'll have to, like, have a first dance. And then she's dancing silly and Andrew stops by and sees it. Because that's the point, right? They just want her to look silly in front of Andrew.
I also thought it would be a moment where Andrew sees Margaret indulging his grandma, you know, and bonding with her. And that's another moment in the trope, right? Where you see your love interest bonding with people you love, and that makes you like them more. I didn't really see that from Andrew when he stumbles upon Margaret doing this dance. I thought that was an opportunity, but yeah, I didn't really feel any kind of like emotional shift or anything. I will say, leading up to this part, Margaret is biking through the woods, and this is a parallel to the opening scene where she was on an exercise bike, but there were woods, like virtual woods on the screen, and I kind of like how that highlighted the artificial quality of the life she lived and lacked genuine relationships with the people around her compared to now when she's, you know, got more people around her that she genuinely connects with.
So Andrew walked in on Margaret. I mean, I guess he already knew she was racist, so... But they do go into town to pick up her new phone. And she has to go to an internet cafe to use the computer. And they're still using dial-up. And she doesn't know what dial-up is. She's like, what is that sound? And I'm like, Margaret, how old are you? But she does see Andrew and Gert talking outside from the window and gets all morose about it. And when she asks him about Gert, he's just like, yeah, I guess it's nice to see her. And they don't really talk more about it. I wish they had. This is that depth that I'm lacking. They're friends now. They can talk about this shit and then we'll get more depth and then their relationship will have more meaning.
I agree. This scene felt too short because I already didn't really buy Margaret being torn up about Andrew talking to Gert because I don't buy that she has feelings for him yet. I feel like every time they're on the verge of an emotional breakthrough, his family comes in and interrupts and whisks one of them away. And it happens several times, including here, because his mom and grandma show up out of the blue and take Margaret away for a wedding dress fitting.
Yeah, they fit her into the grandma's old dress, which is very old-fashioned. I think they just didn't take it in enough or something.
They had one day to prepare, which is like their fault.
I know. That was crazy. It had like a million pins, and it's this like satiny fabric. I'm like, you guys, that you're not getting that done in one day. And you know what? They didn't. It didn't look good.
Yeah.
Up close.
You probably had to staple it together or something. But his grandma also gives her a necklace that's been in the family for generations. And this is when it finally dawns on Margaret that she is risking very real people's feelings with this whole scheme because she immediately panics and takes off in the boat with Andrew. For a second, while they're standing in front of the mirror, it almost seems like she's about to tell the grandma. And then at the end, she's like, oh, we have enough time to sew up the dress and everything.
I thought she was going to share the fact that she doesn't have any family left, and that's why she's feeling really emotional. Because like part of it is also the mom says like maybe we can see you for the holidays, and this is like a thread that I really like the whole thing with Andrew and his parents. I really like it, but again, there's no nuance to it, especially in the wrap up.
Yeah. It's a very emotionally touching moment when Margaret finally realizes that she has a family now. She has people she can call her own after a long time. And it's really lovely, but I kind of don't like that it's followed up by this dramatic scene again, where again, they're relying too much on the physical comedy to make us believe in her relationship with Andrew. Because what happens is she's in the speedboat with him and she basically ends up falling into the water and he pulls her out. It just feels too over the top compared to the sentimental nature of the previous scene.
Basically, she's like freaking out about like the family thing and about the fact that she like forced him into this, and he keeps insisting that no, I agreed to it. And I don't know how I feel about this. Since this whole time, there's this understanding between them that the circumstances mean that she has this kind of complete power over him, but like at the end of the day, he still has choices. I don't like that part of what she's freaking out about is that I forced you into this, because to buy into this whole thing, we have to believe that she didn't. It kind of ruins the fun aspect of the movie for me. It has to be actually not serious, or else it's kind of horrific.
Right. I think I get what you're saying, because even though we're not perceiving it as such, it's like she is believing that she is forcing him into this, even though that's not what the circumstances demand.
It almost like even changes their whole dynamic this whole time. It's like, wait, was this real the entire time? It's almost like, are you actually mean? I thought we were joking around. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. A better freak out probably would have been what part of it was about her dragging his family into this and jeopardizing Andrew's relationship with them.
She's already freaking out about that, so like that's enough. You don't need to also freak out about like forcing him into it, because that ruins it.
Yeah. I'm also just imagining this scene taking place someplace quiet and just the two of them get to talk instead of this like over dramatic thing in the boat with her shouting at him because it's so loud, and they're both sort of talking at each other and it's very hectic. And given the scene that comes after this, I think this could have been another turning point where they might start liking each other, because I still don't get that yet. So I feel like this scene could have been it, where they reaffirm the fact that they are in it together and that Andrew tells her that he trusts her enough to not put his relationship with his family in jeopardy. I feel like that would have given the story a little bit more emotional depth, but what we do get is very shallow, pun intended.
Yeah, I don't think the boat aspect bothered me as much, but that's because I was more preoccupied with another thing that I hate about this scene.
What is that?
I hate when they're like, no, but what if we get found out and blah, 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 and then we'll break everyone's hearts, like your family's hearts and blah, blah. And I'm like, then don't tell them. There's nothing that has changed between when you first went into this scheme and now. Like, you went into it knowing there was going to be family, knowing like all of the stakes, and you're like, yeah, we'll go into it, we can pull this off. And then halfway through, they'll like lose the courage to do it and then hurt everyone's feelings. You're doing this to yourself.
Did you catch what Margaret said during her confession at the wedding? She said it's not easy to ruin someone's life once you find out how wonderful they are. So she basically didn't care in the beginning. That's what's changed. Suddenly she likes these people and she's like, oh shit, I don't want to hurt their feelings.
That's the part that like I always have a hard time with. I'm like, you are hurting their feelings by like calling this off or whatever midway through. I also don't like how it's repeated, because Andrew has had like this moment before and now she has it too, and they have to like comfort the other person, and I'm like, it's too repetitive. I don't like it once, I definitely don't like it twice. But yeah, there is this, like you said, really nice scene afterwards that's really quiet, and I really like everything that's like unsaid.
Yeah, for once.
Yeah. But actually, talking about finding out, someone does find out, kind of, and it's the dad, because The immigration guy actually like called him up and asked about them because he's checking up on them, and the dad immediately clocks it for what it is. And I cannot believe the dad. This is what made him a villain to me, aside from the, hating books, I guess, which is already a villain trait. He flew the guy up there, which we know takes 4, if not 5 modes of transportation.
Depends on if he's wearing heels.
I'd be so mad if I was Andrew, and Andrew is mad. But basically the dad like negotiated a deal for them. And if Andrew tells the truth, he'll be off the hook. And Andrew is mad, and obviously he cares about Margaret now. So he sticks to his story and like storms out. If I were him, you know what I would do? I would call off tomorrow's wedding and be like, you know what? I will not get married with you there. Margaret and I will live back in New York. And we're heading home. I would be so upset. That is so mean, the thing that the dad did.
It is, especially because the dad pulls them into the barn where they're supposed to get married, and that's where they meet the lawyer. But yeah, I wish there was a bit more of a connection between Margaret and Andrew at this point. More palpable romantic feelings, so that the nature of the lie changes a bit compared to when they were talking to the lawyer in the beginning. Because if it's basically half truth at this point, it would be even more ironic that their lie is getting discovered. But it feels like a repetition, except, I mean, Andrew's a little bit more sure about it, but still it feels like a repetition of when they talked to the lawyer in the first place. I didn't really feel any development in their relationship.
I agree.
There were no aha moments for me. There's no point where I'm like, she started to like him a little bit, or he likes her now. The entire time I'm like, oh, they're becoming friends. This is so cute. But it's not the same. It's a rom-com. Because isn't that the point of the pretense almost being discovered, or actually being discovered? Because it's the cruel irony that by the time that happens, the lie isn't really a lie anymore. So that's where the emotional tension, the emotional depth would have come in for me. And because that was missing, I think that's also what contributes to the film just feeling shallow and incomplete.
And then suddenly it's the wedding day.
Right? Suddenly.
Suddenly, that wedding day hit me like a truck. Andrew storms out of the house. The next thing you know, they're walking down the aisle. I'm like, holy shit.
There were no shots of them setting up or anything. No establishing shot or whatever. We just straight to the barn.
But they actually don't go through with it because Margaret has to like stop the wedding and confess everything and leave.
I think we already know your feelings about this.
Honestly, all I want is for them to not do this in front of everybody. Can Margaret just have this talk with Andrew alone? I don't hate the scene because of the calling off the scheme trope. I've surrendered to that. I've accepted that. I have grieved. I have grown. I have learned. What I don't like about this is the fact that she's doing it in front of everybody. I'm like, if you're trying to save Andrew, save him the embarrassment, Margaret. Every time this happens, I'm like, you know you're dooming your partner, right? Especially at this point of the movie or the story or whatever. The other person has already fallen for them and wants to go through with it. So I'm like, you're doing this to hurt your partner. Just go to the hallway or something and have a conversation.
It is kind of silly to be doing this at this point where you already have feelings for each other. So it's not like you're being dishonest anymore. Like, yeah, it started off that way, but no one needs to know the details because you know you're not going to hurt their son. You know your feelings are genuine. You know it's going to turn into a genuine relationship. So why bother with the dramatics?
Exactly. And if she doesn't do this, then she's not hurting anyone at all. Like, not even the family that she was worried about hurting. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And also, I don't have as much of a problem with this particular trope as you do, although I do definitely see your point. For me, the worst part is how flat it falls emotionally, because I feel like I'm repeating myself, but this moment should be extra painful because now those feelings are real. Now it makes sense for them to actually be together and plan a future, but now is also when everything falls apart. But I don't feel a twist of cruelty. It just feels like Margaret became friends with Andrew and is now second-guessing, dragging his family into this, but it doesn't really have anything to do with any romantic feelings, which is fine. It would be fine if this weren't a rom-com, and if the movie weren't trying to convince us that they're in love. But yeah, unnecessary dramatics. And it's about to get worse because Margaret leaves.
Andrew wants to go after her and the dad tries to stop him and they start like kind of arguing and the grandma has a heart attack and they have to fly her out to, get her medical help. And it turns out that she's faking a heart attack just to make them like stop fighting and actually reconcile. And also to get Andrew to the airport to go after Margaret. See, if she had actually had a heart attack, I would have hated it. But this is good old grandma.
Yeah. I was actually relieved when we found out that she was pretending. I was like, thank goodness. Otherwise, this is like peak cliche, peak convenient timing for a heart attack.
Very H2O of her, actually.
Oh my god. Yeah, very Mrs. Chatham.
Yeah.
What a reference. I love that. There's a moment where, right before Andrew's about to chase after Margaret, where he finds a note that she left him saying goodbye and telling him that she'll publish the manuscript that he really wanted her to. And Gertrude shows up and he rants to her about Margaret and she hints that he should go after her. But yeah, I like Andrew's reaction when he finds the note because it's pure frustration. And I just think it falls kind of flat because his relationship with Gert isn't really developed or anything. I feel like maybe if the movie had hinted at the possibility of him developing feelings for her again, this scene would have been stronger because the whole time Margaret is thinking, I wonder if he still likes her. Does he want to get back together with her? Does he regret leaving her? But at this point, when he's faced with Gert after Margaret's out of the way, all he does is talk about Margaret and rant about how upset he is that she's gone. I feel like that would have given the scene some emotional weight, but there wasn't really anything like that. It felt like sort of a transition scene.
I am 100% with you. I really like his reaction to the note. I don't know why Gert is there.
Yeah.
Like, narratively. Like, she seems like such a random person to be there.
Could have been anybody.
Yeah. So, they get there via the grandma's heart attack helicopter.
That is what they call them, yeah.
It's also really funny that he calls the guy who works up at the tower at the airport and tries to stop a whole goddamn plane. Like, if that ain't some rich boy bullshit, honestly.
Yeah. I also just, in general, airport chase scenes are tired, but I especially don't like this one because of the conversation they have on the way, because the grandma, while she's still faking her heart attack, she forces Andrew and his dad to promise that they'll get along and stuff, and I really don't buy that changes anything.
Of course not. Obviously they're just gonna say that because she's gonna die.
Exactly. But Andrew stops being a cheapskate and actually flies back to New York.
Actually, no. Even then, he ran to New York. I actually really
true.
like this. Where, like, obviously he flew there, but, like, Margaret is packing up her office and everything. And when Andrew, like, barges in, he's, like, panting. I had to rush over to see you. And she's like, from Alaska? Yeah, he tells her how he feels and tells her to marry him. I will say, I love that he tells her to marry him. Like, it's like a parallel to how they first got into this whole situation in the first place. He's not like, Margaret, I love you. Will you marry me? He's like, you suck. You marry me. And I'm like, perfect.
That's a great point. We love a good full circle moment.
It just didn't feel like a generic confession that he regurgitates for this, like, inevitable, like, big love confession scene. It's so them.
Yeah, to be fair, I initially did think what he said, marry me because I'd like to date you, was weird to profess his love. But now that we talked about it, and with genuine feelings, marrying each other is like the only way for her to stick around so that they can actually be in a relationship, it does make it quintessentially them. So the thing I didn't like about this scene is that it happens in front of their colleagues at the office.
Same.
And the way he talks to her, I mean, I know they've always been snarky towards each other,
But it's privately.
it's privately. And the way he talks to her in front of everybody feels like he's kind of undermining her because she was vulnerable in front of him and him alone. And it feels cheap that he's bringing up all of these private things in front of everyone.
Especially because one of her vulnerabilities is, like, her position within the company, right? Her position of authority, no less. I also really hate how, like, one of the other 25 assistants or multiple are like, yeah, sure, who's boss, Andrew? And it's like,
Yeah.
gross. It's like straight up
Yeah.
gross. Because the whole thing is like, oh yeah, she's a woman who's been bossing us around, which like they shouldn't be able to do. So now you have to put her in her place. And it's like super gross. I hated that.
Exactly. I thought we left the toxic masculinity back with Andrew's dad in Alaska.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
That aside, I really like how she basically like tries to turn him down. She's like, it's gonna be easier if we just kind of let this go and never see each other again. And he agrees with her. He's like, yeah, it'll be easier. And then like the rest is unsaid. I really liked that like their decision to actually enter a relationship is unsaid. But they decide to get married so she can stay, and they have another interview with the immigration guy. So, in absurd conclusion, Gert and Margaret are both women that Andrew dates because they have the same name. He's got a type.
Yeah, that's his one criterion. And in another absurd conclusion, Margaret has 25 assistants who bring her 25 different coffees every single day. Queen of publishing.
Yeah. So, now that we have discussed this movie in excruciating detail, have your opinions changed, and would you recommend this movie?
Well, looking back on my past self, I didn't really remember this movie that well, but I do remember that I enjoyed it when I first watched it. But now I think I've enjoyed it a little bit less, just because I feel like there was so much potential that they missed out on because of the movie's inability to develop an emotional core to the story. There were so many moments between them that I feel like would have helped flesh out their relationship a lot more and build those romantic feelings so that by the time we get to the climax, we're really rooting for this relationship, and it hurts when it breaks apart. But yeah, I feel like the movie just doesn't delve deep enough into that, and it wastes too much time on physical comedy and over-the-top dramatics. So ultimately, I think the slightly less than average rating is justified, and I'm not sure that I would recommend it, to be honest. What about you?
I think my opinions have changed because I just like didn't clock the fact that they're just friends the entire movie as like a negative until we had our conversation. And I was trying to figure out like when did I start getting flutters? And it was after he read the note, and that's like the last 5 minutes of the movie.
End of the movie.
Which I did, which to be fair, may also not be a con for other people, but like after a conversation, it is a con for me. I do want them to smooch a little. Not necessarily smooch, but like emotionally smooch.
Yeah, exactly.
So I also enjoyed it a little less. That aside, I still had so much fun with this movie. I guess just like as a comedy, I really liked it. And I would recommend this movie. I think you would have so much fun.
Well, that's it for this movie.
If you have any suggestions for movies we should discuss on the podcast, send them in at graveyard_slot on Instagram, the Graveyard Slot Podcast on Tumblr, or email us at thegraveyardslot@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Graveyard Slot.